There may be some unexpected entertainment from watching the world's most cyber-challenged scientist try to use this computer. And, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so first of all right. Oh, yeah, forgot that too, didn't I? Oh, yeah, I forgot. Oh, yeah. Okay. This is the main thing right here. By the way, when do you normally end the service? Or want me to end my
We're usually done with the service by 2 o'clock.
Okay, no. All right, now we're talking.
Somewhere from 12:15.
Okay, all right. My record is a 1-hour lecture at a California State University, followed by 5 hours of questions. But I have no trouble at all going to 2 o'clock. Now, students, that's a different thing, or you in the congregation. But I get to teach, about 6 out of the past 8 summers, a 2-week short course at Boston Baptist College. Oops, what did I just do? Oh. Oops. Maybe I'm going to have to probably, I could try one more time. And so to get, a whole science course in a 2-week short course, they wind up, the classes run from 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock in a row. And most teachers wear out long before that. But not me. Oh, it's 12 o'clock already? Oh, I've just got a few more. I've got you scared. I'm glad you're still here. And I think I'll give up on this. And I've got it back there. That was try to keep me more on time, and it's not working right now. All right, ready. It is a real pleasure, to be able to speak to a church that's been willing to come on into the 21st century. You would be surprised at the churches that are still left out there that somehow haven't been able to come to terms with science. They're still battling like we were in the middle of the 1800s, like the scientific revolution had never occurred. It's just frightful. Maybe to help you see the problem a little bit, is there anybody here that ever kind of wished they could go on a trip around the world? Anybody here think that might be a fun idea? Okay. Well, okay. Charles Darwin had that opportunity. Okay, he'd flunked out of med school. He got graduated from Bible college, but didn't really like it. His dad was really afraid he was never going to amount to anything, but he really loved insects. He loved collecting beetles in particular. And so his dad, a man of no small influence and resources, managed to get him booked as a naturalist aboard a ship, the HMS Beagle, destined to sail around the world in 5 years, collecting samples of this, that, and the other life forms and making records of what he found, all the way around the world. And can you imagine, a young man growing up in England? Now, England's pretty. I've had a chance to do some creation conferences there. It's part of the Emerald Isle, lush green and all that, foggy and so on. But green is pretty much it. But he sails to the rainforest in Brazil. Birds, everything's brightly colored, just dazzling array, and incredible diversity, more flowers than he'd seen anywhere before. Wow. He was just overwhelmed by the incredible variety that he saw, the first real major stop on the trip. And so he's making notes on all this and so on. They sail around South America, up the west side, and wind up 600 miles west of Ecuador in a group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. Some would like to call it Darwin's Islands. And Darwin on the Galapagos Islands also noticed an incredible amount of diversity. Lots of differences, lots of strange and unusual creatures. But one other thing struck him, even more dramatically. He got there at a time, many of you have seen this here in Florida, when the sea turtles were just hatching out of their eggs, making a mad dash for the sea. Gulp, 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 gulp. Maybe 97 out of 100 got eaten up by predators. In fact, the predators know when that hatching is coming. And there are birds and other things just waiting for the little turtles to make this mad dash for the sea and eat them up. Maybe 3 out of 100 might get into the ocean. Gulp, gulp, 2 out of them. 2 of them get eaten by predators in the ocean. Maybe on average only 1 in 100 would survive to eventually come back and lay eggs to face that same gruesome fate on the shores of that same island. And so Darwin wondered about that. You know, he'd been to Bible college, and he recognized, you know, that, well, there was something in there about God and about salvation and things like that and the God of love, but it didn't look that way. Everywhere he looked, there was a struggle for survival, struggle to the death. Very few of any particular kind would ever even hope to survive. What did it all mean? What did it all mean? And so finally, 5 years later, he gets back to England, and he still spends another 20 years trying to put all this together, all this evidence of variety, beauty, harmony, apparent design, mixed with struggle, death, disease, disaster, famines, plagues. What do you make of it? Finally, the light bulb went on. All that variety, plus the struggle for survival. Survival of the fittest. That was it. Struggle wasn't the enemy of life. Struggle was a way to make life better. And you could see it everywhere. And no matter where you looked, you could see the varieties. Anybody doubt that? All you have to do is look out the window, walk through your yard. Tremendous amount of variety. Does anybody doubt that there's a struggle for survival? Most of us notice it Monday morning early, but there's a struggle for survival going on out there. We know about places in the world that are suffering indeed. And so it looks like what? Evolution is a fact. All this struggle and death will continuously change organisms so they're better and better able to cope with disasters and circumstances in their environment. And so Darwin called it this in the summary paragraphs of his Origin of Species. Darwin put it this way: thus from the war of nature, from famine and death. Now, if you started a sentence that way, how would you end it? Thus from the war of nature, famine and death. You might say, boy, things get worse and worse and worse, and there's disease, there's disaster. We got to do something about this. We got to cure this. No. Darwin said, thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the production of higher animals directly follows. The more struggle, the more death, the more evolution is driven forward to make continuous upward, onward progress and improvement. And yet you still have some Christians that can't count to 3. Does anybody here doubt there's variety in the world? Does anybody here doubt that there's a struggle for survival in nature? Is there anybody here who can't figure out that some are more likely to survive than others? Is there anyone here so tied to an old, outmoded interpretation of a dusty old book written 1,000 years ago or more? More than that. That somehow you've got to oppose evolution? Wouldn't it be better just to say, oh, there's a couple, see, they're sitting on the back row, they're ashamed to come up front. Okay. Can't we just accept evolution as God's way of making things? Wouldn't that be the sensible scientific thing to do? Well, I once thought so. And I can say past tense before everybody runs out. And that was what I used to say to my classes. You know, it's obvious that evolution's a fact. You can see variety. You can see the struggle for survival. You can obviously figure out that some are more likely to survive than others. Evolution's a fact. And of course, once in a while, boy, more than once in a while, you know, I'd have students, but you know, Christian students would keep annoying me. Well, you know, but what about, you know, and I said, well, what about what? It says, well, maybe couldn't evolution be God's means of creation? You'd be shocked how many Christians have bought into that. And you know what I'd say to the Christian students that ask me that? Evolution, God's means of creation? Don't you people believe that, you know, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to conquer struggle and death? If God's been using struggle and death to make things better and better and better for millions of years, then Jesus would be opposing the plan of God. You don't understand the Bible, you don't understand evolution, either one. Besides that, who'd want to pray to a God that fumbled around for 1 billion years trying to get it right, tried to make man several times, wind up with some apes that went extinct, and finally got it around to making us? What kind of a God is that? And besides that, who wanted to pray to a God that made so many mistakes, he buried them in the ground, turned them into stone, hoped nobody discover all these fossils that are testimony, a record of just death on a colossal scale? And here you're trying to tell me this is a God of love, would use evolution? By the way, anybody here know fellow Christian, a friend, who thinks God used evolution to create things? Oh, come on now. So a lot of you have to know somebody like that. Might be somebody in your own family, might be a friend and so on. But yeah, okay. So anyway, I was one of those for a while. I thought, well, okay, I could see that. Somebody can believe that if you want to, as long as you know that evolution is a fact. It's all right to say God did it. Well, after I became, how did I ever become a Christian? Well, I wasn't looking for God. Little did I know He was looking for me. So the change started when I got invited to a Bible study by a chemistry professor at a college where I was a professor of biology. And the last thing in the world I wanted to do was study the Bible, but 3 keys to successful evangelism. Are you ready? You might want to take notes. 3 keys to successful evangelism. Free coffee and donuts, okay? Or at the Tyndall House, that's free tea and wow, cupcakes, okay? Works just as good. And so that was the lure that the chemistry prof used to get us to come to Bible study. And we were new on the faculty, and I thought this would be a good chance to meet some others. And my wife had grown up in the church, and this would maybe satisfy her a little bit. So we started going to that Bible study. And so, I opened the Bible to read it, what? So I could criticize it more effectively. God uses all kinds of ways to get you to read the Bible. And so I started in the beginning. Okay, and here's this Genesis. And it talks about how God created a perfect world. Our first parents had free access to the tree of life. There was no death, no struggle, no evolution. Okay, those are the ingredients for evolution, struggle and death. And they were absent in God's original creation. And I said to the Bible teacher, well, come on, who believes this kind of stuff? Turn on the TV, look out the window, pick up a newspaper. Fires, floods, famines, plagues, AIDS virus, bubonic plague, Ebola. The place is a mess. Obviously, the Bible doesn't know what's going on. What did the Bible teacher say? Well, read on. So I read on, to just the 3rd chapter. That perfect, wonderful world only lasted for 2 chapters. And then in chapter 3, we find out what? Okay, that's where sin entered the world. And so the sin of Adam and Eve, and it began just with Satan asking the question that continues to plague the church. Says to Eve, what? Did God really say? Eve knew what God said. If you eat of this one fruit, you had access to everything but this one fruit. If you eat that, you'll surely die. She knew that. But did he really say that? Or was he meaning something else? He gave you a brain. He expects you to use it. Ever hear that one? And so, look, there's nothing wrong with that fruit. There are no, spines sticking out of it that would hurt you if you took a slice. There's no poison dripping out of it. He wants you to be like God. Ever heard that one before? That's been used for centuries and millennia. Okay, and so that was enough. That brought struggle and death into the world. It got so bad that perhaps the saddest verse in Scripture, I might even put it ahead of Jesus wept, is it grieved God to his heart that he created man and the other creatures. The earth was so filled with violence and death because of them in Genesis 6. And yet, according to Darwin, that's what makes everything better. Violence, struggle, and death. That's the pathway to progress. And where does Jesus fit in the evolutionary gospel? Well, he actually doesn't fit because he's trying to reverse struggle and death that makes things better and better and better. And so he doesn't really belong there. So we can do away with him and just keep, the struggle and death part. And so I was wondering about that. This didn't seem to make very much sense, but I did, as I thought about it, I realized, why have I been so enthused about evolution? Evolution is really a theory of millions of years of struggle and death until death wins. They don't really tell you. Evolutionists are very good about not telling you what evolution really is. See, when I was all gung-ho and enthusiastic about evolution, I thought evolution meant step-by-step, upward, onward progress. And they try to use it in the general language, for that step-by-step, upward, onward progress. That sounds like something a Christian could believe, all right? But that's not what it really is. It's step-by-step, upward, onward progress based on millions of years of struggle and death, time, chance, struggle and death, time, chance, struggle and death, until death wins. And so once in a while after I became a Christian, I was teaching biology, and you get some evolutionists on TV, and I'd wheel a TV cart. in the room and let the students hear the evolutionists directly for themselves. And so they had a fossil expert on there one time, and so they're taking questions for the audience, and somebody asked, well, what does the future hold? Now, when I was a young, naive, ignorant evolutionist, I said, oh, the future is wonderful. Pretty soon we'll all have IQs of 300. We won't have any toes anymore because we wear shoes all the time, and it'll just be wonderful, you know. But the paleontologist, the evolutionist, says, well, the only thing I'm sure of is every species eventually becomes extinct, and that'll happen to man as well. And the audience breaks into applause. We're all going to become extinct. Yay, let's hear it for evolution. I don't know why I was so excited about that. I was on a TV program done in Canada one time, and it was an evolution creation one, and I with big sad eyes, and Dr. Swinton came on. He said, I grew up in a religious household, and it was wonderful to believe that we were put here with the plan and purpose of a loving God to superintend and care for the earth. But the whole of my science education has convinced me that's not true. We'll all eventually die. Every species dies. It's not yet clear what animal or plant will replace man, but the doom is sure. You could see where the big sorrowful eyes came from. And believe me, sometimes people come to me and say, I don't want to, I'm in school, they're teaching evolution. Can you write me a note so I don't have to go to class? No, I wouldn't if I could. The more you know about evolution, the less likely you are to believe it. You know, they try to hide what it's really all about, make you think it's just upright. You ask, well, give me some examples of this upright, upward progress. And that's not what they talk about. Millions of years of struggle and death till death wins. The astronomer they had on the program, they asked him, well, what does the future hold? And he says, well, the only thing I'm sure of is next April on the cosmic calendar, the sun will expand. The whole earth will be incinerated. We'll all burn to a crisp if any of us are still left. And the audience breaks into applause. If we're not extinct, we get to get incinerated. Wow, let's hear it for evolution. I don't know. Why does somebody really get excited about that? It just, doesn't really kind of add up. And then I began to think about the biblical message that I was learning more about in that Bible study. Well, Christ came to conquer struggle and death. That's not our friend. That's not the pathway to progress. That's our enemy. And the Bible makes it quite clear, death is the enemy. And so Christ delivers us from struggle and death. From man's sin has been conquered in Christ. Life wins. New life in our risen Lord. And so, in spite of my evolutionary background, I could at least see that was a better idea. And so I could see why somebody would want to be a Christian. The Bible has a happy ending. Now we're talking. The Bible has a happy ending, just like all those other fairy tales. Now, it seems to me some of you have to have people in your family, people, friends that you know that you've been witnessing to in some cases for years, and you keep sharing with them the good news of new life in Christ. Life wins. It's not millions of years of struggle and death till death wins. Life wins, and you can be part of it. And yet they say what? No thanks, I'd rather die. Why would anybody say that? They may not say it out loud, but that's what they act like. Because they'd love to believe it, but it just can't be true. It's just another fairy tale. Evolution has proven there is no God. By the way, there's a terrific 30-minute DVD by Ray Comfort, Evolution versus God. That would be a good study DVD. And so that's where I was. I could see it was good. When we opened our museum in Arcadia, every village, has a local atheist. And so I used to do a radio program in Arcadia. And, one caller would call in. He'd have all this evolution stuff, and so I could answer him because I once believed it, and then I'd figured out what was wrong with it, and so on. And so we'd go back and forth. Well, we opened a museum, and it was an open house for the community. And so Art comes in, the fellow from the radio, and he looks around. He said, well, this is pretty impressive. He says, I'm Art. I said, well, I'm Gary. How are you? Glad to have you. No, I'm Art from the radio. I'm the atheist that keeps calling you about evolution. Oh, really? He said, well, I can see why you believe it. You really do believe this. And you have, I said, well, you don't have to. And he actually told me, he said, I believe you'd have a better life if you just pretended to be a Christian. I said, well, you don't have to pretend. You can actually be a Christian. No. People have told me all about the plan of salvation, all about that and so on. It's a great idea, but it's just not true. It's just a fairy tale. And so this is maybe the most serious point. Don't misunderstand. But when we're talking creation evolution, it's not a side issue. It's a central, foundational salvation issue. Now, don't misunderstand. It doesn't mean that you have to believe everything I believe about carbon-14 and layers in Grand Canyon and starlight and time and all those things like that. What it means is, and this is what I experienced, it's a stumbling block to even considering the claims of Christ. So when I was younger, when I was still a non-Christian, Christians would invite me to go to church. And so what were my questions? Do you guys have a basketball court? Do you have a swimming pool? Do you go on field trips? Do you have a coffee shop? Nothing about, do you preach the Word of God? You do tell about salvation? Do you help me grow in Christ? None of that. It was just a, might be interesting social commitment if they were, in the area or something like that. And so I couldn't even, I'd hear people telling me about it. And of course, a Bible teacher, all the arguments he used for evolution, I keep answering his arguments, but I keep losing the argument. Well, I just switched to another one. I'd lose that argument. I'd switch to another one. That went on for 3 years. And I kept losing the arguments for evolution and winning new life in Christ. So that turned out to be kind of a nice trade. But this is not a new issue. This is Paul's warning to Timothy way back in the 1st century to avoid profane and vain babblings and oppositions of, you see the red letters, science falsely so called. There is no better definition of evolution than that. Science falsely so called. Evolution is perhaps the most anti-scientific idea that's ever gained any kind of popularity. And it's just not science from the beginning. It never was science, never will be science, never could be science. Well, why not? It's a belief about the past. The reason science progresses, the reason I got interested in it, is science is rock hard stuff. You can see it, you can test it, you can measure it. And you can see whether your idea works or whether it doesn't work. And other people can repeat your experiments, see if they get the same results or not. And so it used to frustrate me that philosophers and theologians were talking about things written centuries ago. They were still having arguments that hadn't been settled in the 1400s or 300 BC. Science was making progress. And that's right, science does. Why? Because it limits itself to ideas that can be tested by observations in the present that others can repeat. Well, evolution is a belief about what happened in the distant past. Unique one-time sequence of events that's never been observed and never been explained and never even been logically argued. It doesn't have anything to do with science. You can make deductions from evolutionary faith and test them scientifically. Every time you do that, evolution loses. They haven't passed a single test. Every missing link they ever proposed for this chain of evolutionary changes has been disproved by the evolutionists themselves. In science, that would mean there's something wrong with your theory. But evolutionists keep on plugging away. And the goal of science is to make and to use theories, to cure diseases, to put men on the moon, to look for patterns of order that help us understand and relate to parts of nature and so on. The goal of evolution is to replace the idea of God with something made up in the image of man, the creature, rather than the creator. And they've been very good at that. But that's not science. They've even changed the definition of science. And so science used to be a search for the truth about nature. Did something happen to my microphone? Oh, okay. But now it's a search for naturalistic explanations about nature. And evolutionists freely said, even if you could find evidence for creation, it wouldn't count because it's not science. It can't be because they ruled it out by definition. How many of you have ever seen the movie Expelled that Ben Stein did? His last one he interviewed was Richard Dawkins. And, Dawkins, it just likes to blaspheme God. He just loves doing that kind of stuff. No, there can't be any evidence for creation, so there's no evidence for creation. No, there's no evidence for creation. There couldn't be any evidence for creation. And Ben Stein, no evidence for creation. But
And then he shoots his own self in the head. Says, but if there ever were evidence of creation, it wouldn't be God. It would be what? Aliens, okay? And so aliens are the real heroes for the evolutionists. Francis Crick deservedly shared the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA structure. And he's a smart enough biochemist. He worked on the origin of life for years, trying to come up with, how life evolved out of chemicals on the earth. And he announced at a meeting I went to at the University of California, San Diego, we now know that chemical evolution did not happen on Earth. Okay, so he's still an evolutionist, but everything we know about chemical reactions on Earth shows us it's not going to happen. And so he assumed what? It happened out there, somewhere else. And his book is called The Seeds of Life, from outer space. And he actually told the audience, he says, my wife says, isn't that just pushing the problem back to another time and place? His snappy reply, she has a good point. And so he didn't even try to come up with that. It was just wishful thinking, not even a scientific idea to test. So boy, oh boy. But it keeps people from even considering the claims of Christ. They already know that there is no spiritual dimension. As Carl Sagan once put it, the cosmos is all there is. There ain't no more. It's just matter. There is no spiritual dimension. Why would Christians want to compromise with the belief that there's no spiritual dimension? It doesn't seem to fit. But what about all those evidences that I used to use to prove evolution in my classes? Natural selection. Now, natural selection is really a euphemism, and they love using that term. Has anybody here ever met somebody that's in favor of abortion? I doubt it. I saw some hands. I'm not calling you a liar, but I could be wrong, but I'm kind of expecting you've never gone up to somebody and says, what's your view on, life before birth or abortion? I'm in favor of abortion. I think we ought to kill kids before they're born if it's inconvenient for the mother. We ought to have a right to kill whoever we want to, whenever we want to, as long as they haven't been born. Nobody ever says that. What do they say? Well, I'm not in favor of abortion. I'm in favor of what? Choice. Okay. Not the baby's choice, that's for sure. But they try to make it sound better than it really is. And that's what natural selection. What is natural selection? Darwin told us. The war of nature, famine, and death. I went all the way through with high honors to a doctoral degree in biology. I never heard that once. I discovered that on my own later on after I became a creationist and reread Darwin's book, that it's just filled with all kinds of things like that. The war of nature, famine, and death. That's where the production of higher animals directly comes from. Didn't really seem to fit at all. But what about, those famous peppered moths? This is one I loved using. Back in the 1850s, there was lichen on these trees in England, and there's a light-colored moth you can hardly see in there because it's so well camouflaged. Here's the light one, but the dark one stood out, so when the moth is sleeping on the tree during the daytime, the birds would, they could see the dark moth, and so back in the 1850s, only 2% of the population was dark. The rest of them were light, and then soot, killed the lichen on the trees. Now the dark moth was camouflaged. You can't hardly see it in here at all. And the light moth was the one that got eaten more. And so, wow, in just 100 years, the moth population changed from 98% light to 98% dark. Evolution going on today. I'd say that to my students. How can you doubt it? You can see it with your very eyes. Are there any problems with that? Of course, evolution is a theory about how one kind of life changes into another kind of life. Did the moth change into another kind of life? Did it change into another kind of moth? Did it change into a moth with a different color? No. All the moths of all the different colors, actually 5 different colors of the peppered moth, all existed at the same time. And are those moths that you see pictured there, were they waiting to be eaten by birds? No, they were already dead. They were glued to the tree trunk at the height of the photographer for this picture. So the real moth, God didn't make no stupid creatures. They're up in the branches of the tree where there's multiple colored backgrounds, and they have an instinct to find a background that matches them. And when they couldn't find one, they didn't say, oh, I've lost the struggle for survival. I guess I'll just die. No, They flew off to another forest. So it's not the environment that changes the organism, it's the organism that changes its environment. When it's stuck in an environment where there's not enough to eat or there's not camouflage, it moves on. Okay, the environment doesn't do that. It doesn't induce changes in them and so on. And finally, it's become recognized, but it took a long time. What about Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands? There's a creationist book with fabulous pictures done by Answers in Genesis out there, and multiple creation authors. I've got a little section in it on the Galapagos Islands. And so how did Darwin explain the Galapagos finches? Some have little beaks, some have medium beaks, some have big beaks. By the way, there's nothing wrong with having a big beak, okay? But at any rate, so how did Darwin explain that? The same way a Bible-believing Christian would. He said, when I was sailing around the South American mainland, I saw these little finch birds like you can buy in a pet store. All different kinds, different forests in South America. Some had big beaks for crushing seeds. Some had little beaks for crushing insects. And let's imagine a mat of vegetation washed out, and carried these birds to an island. That really does happen on a routine basis. And so the big-beaked birds survived where there were seeds to eat. The little-beaked birds survived where there were insects to eat. And so-called natural selection just explains how and where living things survive as they multiply and fill the earth. God built in the variability. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And so nothing at all. It didn't change from one kind of bird into another. There was a book that came out while I was still teaching at Clearwater Christian College. Two researchers had spent 20 years in the Galapagos Islands measuring the beaks of finches. And they finally came to the conclusion, they're changing. And they were. And they noticed that in wet years, the beaks were a little bigger, and in dry years, the beaks were a little smaller. And the book review in the St. Petersburg Times says, Christians may as well throw away their Bibles. Evolution's a done deal. Would any of the women here have another explanation for why a beak made out of the same protein that makes up hair might change its thickness or shape, whether it's wet or dry? Oh yeah, forgot about that. So keratin normally swells and shrinks with changes in moisture. They didn't measure anything. No genetic influence whatsoever. I think I'll keep the Bible and throw away the book or the book review. And it just goes on and on and on. Well, modern evolutionists, now where do you get new traits from? Darwin was a Lamarckian. He thought the environment directly, the use and disuse. The giraffe got its longer neck by stretching for leaves in the tree when the prairie grass was drying out. Well, the only problem with that is it doesn't work. Okay, that's not the way genetics works at all. So modern evolutionists have added chance, random changes in heredity, like you see here in fruit flies subjected to radiation. And so fruit fly mutations have done almost everything to organisms except improve them. And so here's a turkey that's redrawn from a textbook in genetics I had, born with one set of chromosomes. So it didn't have any good genes to cover up the bad mistakes. So its head wobbled from side to side, neurological disorder, feathers missing in patches, had to be transferred to a germ-free chamber. The bad thing about mutations is the bad thing about mutations. They make things worse, not better. They're recognized by the disease, defects, and abnormalities they cause. And so besides that, a mutation is only a change in a gene that already exists. And so the most you can get out of it is variation within kind, and it's downhill negative variation at that. And so it points back to creation. The gene has to be there first, but it also points to corruption, the introduction of disease, defects, disease organisms into God's once perfect creation before sin. Richard Lewontin, who hated me for quoting him so often because he understood all this, said the perfection of adaptations is the chief evidence of a supreme designer. And he went on to say in an article he wrote on adaptation, plants, if the environment dries up, plants can grow deeper roots to get to the water, but then he said, if and only if they have genes for making longer roots. They have to have that first. And so he said adaptation comes first, and then who survived comes second. Well, that's God's plan and purpose for them to multiply and fill the earth. One of my favorite examples are these birds that make their living banging their head into trees. Did you ever wonder What would give a bird the idea of banging his head into a tree like a woodpecker does? And we have a couple of pileated woodpeckers that make nests on our property regularly. And wow, if you're gonna, bang your head into a tree, you better have a heavy-duty bill, a heavy-duty skull, some shock-absorbing tissue between the two, some nerve and muscle coordination that's really gonna make this a dead-on hit. When a woodpecker hits a tree, the deceleration experience is 1,000 times gravity. Well, you all have probably seen multiple times, photographs of astronauts, on liftoff, their faces all squished back. Well, that's only 3 to 5 times gravity. The woodpecker experiences 1,000 times gravity. And so if the nerve and muscle coordination wasn't perfect, it slipped to the left or right, and the shearing force would literally spin the cover off the brain. So where'd woodpeckers come from? Well, according to evolution, you always begin with something simpler. Now, I can't believe I once taught this as a fact of evolution, but according to evolution, there was a time when there weren't any woodpeckers on Earth. There were other birds, but they weren't woodpeckers. And so imagine, here's a bird flying along, minding its own business, sots. It gets hit with a cosmic ray. The first step in evolutionary progress is some sort of damage to a gene. Well, this was a really lucky one because it didn't just hit a bird, it hit a mama bird that was carrying an egg that she was just about ready to lay. And cosmic rays go through us all the time and then go all the way through the body. And so this one went through her body, but it hit a gene in the egg that she was carrying, and it changed that gene. So this little baby bird was born with a really heavy-duty bill. Wow, just by chance. And so he slams his head into the tree. His bill is fine, but squishes in the front of his face. He still had that thin skull. Massive cerebral hemorrhage. One dead bird. Now you know why evolution is so slow, don't you? It's all those dead birds at the bottom of the tree. And an evolutionist might say, no, you got it backwards. The first lucky mutation was a heavy-duty skull. That's what came first. Okay, rewind. Mama bird flying along, zots, gets hit with a cosmic ray, goes through her body, hits a gene in the egg. Little baby bird's born with a heavy-duty skull. Whack, throws his head into the tree. This time his skull is okay, but crinkle, 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 a bill pulls up like an accordion. You're nowhere unless both of those things happen at the same time. It was Darwin who said, if there's any feature of any living thing that cannot be explained as a result of one step at a time changes, with each step having its own survival value, because they got to build a whole new population to make time for the next change, my whole theory will have been disproven. It's been disproven tens of thousands of times. Michael Behe, in the book Darwin's Black Box, just to explain, you just can't do that. So many features, most of the features in living things depend on multiple traits working together. And by the way, if the woodpecker ever got that worked out, since the fall, some of those woodpeckers are doing more than drilling holes to store acorns. They're looking for beetles in the bark. Well, the beetles hear all that pounding, and so to get beetles out of the bark, the woodpecker needs a long, sticky tongue. Well, if you get a long, sticky tongue just by chance, what are you going to do with it? Here it is dangling out of your bill. Keep biting your tongue. That's got to be irritating. Hop along the ground, you trip over your tongue. That's got to be frustrating. Flying along over a low twig, tongue wraps around the twig, you hang yourself. Okay, that's a real hazard. And so the answer for the woodpecker is to slip that tongue in a sheath that goes all the way around the skull under the scalp and inserts into the right nostril. So the next time you see a woodpecker, probing for beetles on a tree, grab your binoculars and look, and you can see the scalp twitch as that tongue goes in and out of the tongue sheath. But there would be no reason to have a tongue sheath without a tongue to put in it. It'd be dangerous to have a tongue without a tongue sheath. So you're right back to what Lewontin said was the chief evidence for a supreme designer. Wow. And then I started thinking about all of these things I used to use to prove evolution. DDT-resistant flies, peppered moth, flu virus, drug-resistant bacteria. None of those are changes from one kind to the other. None of them involve the increase not even one new gene that has some brand new function it never had before.
The logical inference is not change from one kind to another, but just variation within kind. That leaves one more question. Do I really mean that? Is it possible that God could create so much variation that human beings, for example, if we've been here only 6,000 years since Adam and Eve, think of all the people. Think of all the variation and traits you have in people. Think of all the different skin colors there are in people. By the way, how many skin colors, about 7 billion people on Earth today, how many different skin colors are there among the 7 billion people we have on Earth today? Thousands? Millions? Hundreds? Dozens? It may surprise you to know there's only one skin color. We all have the same skin color, just different amounts of it. The exception are albinos that don't make any melanin at all, but anybody who has any skin color has the same basic skin color protein, melanin. You can have a lot of it or a little of it, but it's all the same thing. Wow. You know, think of all the misconceptions. Now, there had been feuds between people and, different kinds of prejudice before Darwin, but Darwin just went up by orders of magnitude, and it was a new kind of prejudice. It's a prejudice based on amounts of melanin, skin color. And yet, all what you see there, you can have a little bit of melanin, be very light-skinned. You can have a lot of melanin, have a dark shade of melanin skin color. You can be somewhere in between. There is a variation in the molecule. Regular melanin, eumelanin, grades black through to brown. Phyomelanin grades red through to yellow, for those of you of Scotch-Irish ancestry. So there's a little variation right there. Plus, it's also influenced by how much blood flows near the surface, what kind of fat you have under your skin. The difference between yellow skin and red skin is two kinds of medium brown. But take a look at this. Well, there's a family. Oh, yeah, that's mine. A few years ago, we've added 2 more grandchildren since then. So we had 4 children and 10 grandchildren. I don't know what's wrong with them. No great-grandchildren yet, but okay. And about anything you see, in fact, the 2 on, let's see, as you look at it, it's on your left. That's me and my wife. And we have a terrible time getting a photograph together. Because either, whatever you set the camera on, I'm either so dark I disappear into the background, or Mary's so white, she washes out. So, and look at all the variation among the children. Well, look at this square. Some of you are, I had that in high school. I never want to do this again, and so on. Well, this is just the possibilities. The Bible doesn't really tell us how much melanin our first parent had or what skin color they were. From a design point of view, the best place to start is in the middle. That's where you get the most variation in the least amount of time. And God's purpose was to have them multiply and fill the earth. And this would apply to the shape of the ears, the eyes, height, weight, all kinds of things, feather color and birds, it just works real well. And so if we assume, which is all we could do here, that Adam and Eve had a medium amount of melanin, there are 2 pairs of genes that control the amount of it. One gene makes the melanin, and 2 other pair control how much of it you have, big and little a, big and little b. Well, if Adam and Eve were big and little a, big and little b, that chart shows a possible combination among their children, Cain, Abel, Seth, their brothers and sisters. And notice, if they start medium like this, 1 out of 16 on average of their children would have all the capital letter genes, make the most melanin, have the darkest skin color. A brother or sister would have all little letter genes. What am I? I'm pressing something else here, aren't I? Have the lightest possible skin color. Now, I've been doing a lot of seminars with Ken Ham. He's got some interesting additional pictures of twins, dark and light. It's Australian twins, English twins, all over the world. This happens on a regular, repeatable basis, although you don't hear as much about it as you really ought to. On average, only 6 out of 16 would be medium skin color like their parents. 4 would be a shade lighter, 4 would be a shade darker. Notice, by the way, all this variation from 1 kind of skin color to 5 in 1 generation. No death, no struggle, no war of nature. God planned things, to multiply and fill the earth. And so he gave people, he gave living organisms, plants and animals, the ability to move into high environments, low environments, wet environments, dry environments, dark environments, light environments, all of these kinds of things. right from the word go. They just multiply and scatter out. Fill the earth, no long amount of time, no chance, no struggle, no death. Organisms moving into the environments for which they have been suited by God right from the word go. Take a look. Here's that chart again. Notice what happens when people break up into smaller groups, like after the Tower of Babel. And so if some people went into Central Africa, for instance, and they took with them only the capital letter genes, well, that's all they could pass on. So their children would be very dark generation after generation. If another group took only the little letter genes, they'd be very light generation after generation. If you took either this combination or that one, like the American Indians, Polynesians, and so on, you'd be a medium generation after generation. But where people of different backgrounds get back together again, you're back to no more and no less variation than God built into the first people. The Human Genome Project that you've heard so much about finally came to the biblical conclusion. When you see a conflict with the Bible and science, just hang on. Science will catch up and show you the Bible's been right all along. And so the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, we got to do away with the term race. There's only one race. The differences between what people call races today in ethnic groups are way too small. They're smaller than the differences within the group. There's only one race. In fact, it's a ways yet till 2020. I tried this first in 2000. So you get a census form. And so, here it gives you, what race are you? It gives you a long list. Okay, let's face it, I saw Native American, and I got enough Cherokee in me to qualify for, a little something. I was thinking maybe I ought to, check Cherokee and see if I can get in on some of the casino money. But I was looking for something else, so I kept looking down there. Of course, I got a whole bunch of other stuff, too. And finally, I found the blank I was looking for, other, colon. Okay, so the question was, what race are you? And I go down here, and I put in human. And I said, there's only one race, the human race. We're all parts of it, Acts 17:26. Okay, so they didn't put me in jail that year. So I did it again in 2010. Now I'm thinking of starting the Acts 17:26 society. That was Paul preaching on Mars Hill. And so here's this melting pot of the world, in Athens. He says to him, God is made of one blood, all the tribes and tongues and nations, not races, tribes, tongues, and nations, of people for to dwell upon the earth. We're all the same bloodline, all descendants of Adam and Eve, and more recently of Noah. The Bible already knew that. And it's time we reestablish that concept. Notice that little number, and this is the final point, that little number up there in the corner, that's a 1 followed by more than 2,000 zeros. What's that? That's the number of children the average couple today could have, mathematically, not physically, before they'd run out of variation and have to have identical twin. The number of atoms in the known universe is thought to be a 1 followed by 80 zeros. This is way more than all the atoms in the universe. It's a colossally, it's even bigger than the number of connections in the brain, which is estimated at 1 followed by 275 zeros. This is the largest number I think I can relate to anything physically known. Wow. What does that mean? You are completely special. Nobody ever had your combination of traits before. Nobody ever will have in the future. Even if there were parallel universes, there would be another one like you, et cetera, and so on. You are absolutely unique with a special place in God's plan that nobody else can take. What are most kids hearing in school? Oh, you're just a product of time and chance destined for death. Oh, you're just a product of time and chance destined for death. Oh, you're just a product of time and chance destined for death. No. You're a product of plan and purpose. An absolutely unique individual with a unique place in God's plan. How do you get ahead in the world? The only way to get ahead is to put somebody else down. It's a winner-take-all struggle for survival. Darwinian grim. It's winners and there's losers. That's what it's all about. What's the Bible say? No. We're like living stones fit together. Each of us complements the other. We have different gifts meant to be used in cooperation. And so you can help somebody else be all they can be in Christ. They can help you. Totally different world and life view. And boy, oh boy, do we need more of that world and life view. And so when we look at all of the things that have been tempted to lead us away from just the simple, clear words of Scripture, to compromise with evolution, wow. There's no reason scientifically to do it. There are lots of reasons scientifically not to do it, and even more reasons scripturally and spiritually. When you get in a problem, just wait. Trust God. Take God at His word. And boy, oh boy, that's what works. How did I figure that out finally? I kept fighting and 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 losing the argument, praise the Lord. And these guys in the Bible study would drag me off to men's fellowship meetings. And so I'd go. They were a nice group of guys. And free food, so off I went. Coffee and donuts, okay. So away I go to men's fellowship, and then I'd heckle the speaker afterwards. Well, about that time, I got a copy in the mail of the first book I'd ever written, one on DNA, that magic molecule of heredity. And it had a life-changing impact on me. You might have thought, oh, gee, you wrote a book. I guess now you got a swelled head. But I knew all of the uncertainties, all the things we didn't know about DNA. I was almost surprised they published the book. It was reviewed by experts in the field, got really good reviews and all that. Well, when I wrote the second edition, I had to change over. You know, I couldn't even use that first edition. So much had changed. I started over on blank paper. And so I started thinking, you know, that, oh, here, I was going to show you this too, that, you know, we kind of want to honor scientists, and when they were being scientists, that's a good idea. But here I was looking for answers that scientists can't find. I was looking in the wrong place. And so God had dawned on me, you know, God doesn't have to keep rewriting the Bible. God got it right the first time. And so I actually had kind of a heart attack, the right kind, in the back of a car going to a men's fellowship. And then I began to listen to the people. Here's a cartoon that kind of summarizes this thing. Did you all get BC in a cartoon form up here? Yeah. So here he is chiseling a message in stone. Sometimes I wonder what this world is all about. It can't be just a place for going in and coming out. It can't be just a place for terrorists and crooks and dirty, rotten scoundrels that sell pornographic books. Kind of sounds like our world, doesn't it? Our world wasn't made for wallowing in sickness, death, and sin, or people who give drugs to kids or beat up on their kin. Still sounds like our world. Our world was once a perfect place, a gift of love, not war. Well, why do you suppose he said it that way? Well, according to the Bible, blank is love. Fill in the blank. God is love. What did Darwin substitute for God? The blank of nature. What was that? A war of nature. So he's really saying our world was once a perfect place, a gift of God's love, not war. And we still have the power in ourselves, no, through grace, to make it like before. You want to see how natural selection, survival of the fittest really works? Most of you have seen the Darwin's fish on the back of somebody's car. Maybe you've seen this one. Okay. All right, well, let's pause for a moment of prayer together then. Father, I thank you so much that